Although we tend to consider the populations within any given nation-state to be largely homogeneous in terms of language and ethnicity, early modern Europe was both ethnically and linguistically diverse. This is true not only of the so-called multi-ethnic empires, like those ruled by the Habsburg dynasty and the Ottoman sultans, but even of much smaller territories and cities. 20th and 21st century conceptualizations of nationalities are therefore inadequate for understanding ethnic relations in the early modern period. In this lecture, Dr. Benjamin Conrad and I will give you a brief overview of interethnic relations in early modern Europe. Dr. Conrad will acquaint you with the example of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was home to an ethnically, linguistically, and religiously diverse population. Drawing out from this regional case study, I will discuss the pan-European dimension of the subject through the examples of three ethnic groups: Germans, Jews, and Roma. Before we begin, however, we need to clarify our categories. From today's point of view, references to ethnicity and even nationality appear ubiquitous in early modern texts of all genres. Contemporaries distinguished between the French, Germans, Italians, Poles, Scots, Turks, and so forth, and they even spoke of, say, the Italian nation. A variety of texts and images provide evidence of considerable fascination with the different languages, customs, national characters, such as an assumed natural disposition toward ingenuity or military prowess, and styles of dress associated with different peoples. This fascination found expression not least in handwritten and printed costume albums, such as that of Cesare Vecellio, which was first published in Venice in 1590 and frequently reprinted and translated thereafter. Images like those in this slide were not always purely objective descriptions, though. Sometimes they were stereotypical representations which tell us more about the expectations and prejudices of those who created and commissioned them than those whom they depict. Despite this fascination with what we might call ethnic differences, for most of the early modern period there was no general theory or widely accepted concept of ethnicity or nation in the modern sense. Although the terms used in the sources seem familiar to us, they are often much looser, combining and conflating ethnic, geographic, linguistic, and religious identifications. At times, they also simply indicated subjecthood or the protection of a particular ruler. Nation had little political meaning. When Italian writers used the expression di nazione italiana, they simply indicated that the person in question had been born in the geographic region of Italy. And the term Turk, for example, meant Muslim. Ethnonyms, therefore, frequently served the purpose of excluding those perceived as religious others. A shift towards a more systematic distinction of ethnic groups occurred only in the late 17th and 18th centuries with the formulation of theories of race. Such attempts to establish a scientific categorization of human beings built on the botanist and zoologist Carl Linnaeus' system of taxonomy and were stimulated by European interactions with the inhabitants of other continents. As a result, the term race acquired its modern meaning of membership in a biologically defined ethnic group, which nevertheless remained culturally and socially constructed. Despite the scientific ideals of objective classification, proponents of race theory, like the philosopher Immanuel Kant, drew on old stereotypes, and the resulting categorizations were used to justify colonial rule and slavery. Such theories also encompassed minorities in Europe, like the Scandinavian Sami. Although very influential, such theories provide little insight into the practical organization of interethnic relations in early modern Europe.
The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was one of the 6 largest European polities. Although formally an elective monarchy, contemporaries already referred to Poland-Lithuania as the Republic of Poland, Rzeczpospolita in Polish, because of the great political influence of the wealthiest part of the nobility, the magnates. The slide shows sources from the 18th century, naming Poland a republic, as well as a painting of Poland-Lithuania's king Augustus II, who bore the epithet the Strong. Augustus was of German descent and also elector of the German electorate of Saxony in the early 18th century. The union brought together a variety of different beliefs and languages. Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christians, later also Greek Catholic Christians, formed the dominant religious groups, but there were also large numbers of Jews and Protestants, and a Muslim minority. The map depicts the religious situation of Roman and Greek Catholics, Protestants, and major Jewish communities during the 18th century. Concerning languages, Polish and Ruthenian were the most important Slavonic languages spoken in the Commonwealth. In addition, the population included a considerable number of Lithuanian, German, and Yiddish speakers. It is worth noting that these groups were differentiated not only by their languages and religions, but also by their professions and their geographic distribution. The diversity of the Polish-Lithuanian population further increased as a result of the immigration of groups of Dutch, Italians, and Scots, some of which enjoyed limited forms of communal autonomy. Such multicultural, multilingual, and multireligious societies were not free from conflict. Throughout the early modern period, Poland-Lithuania witnessed several riots over ethnic differences, and occasionally minorities were expelled. This happened, for example, to the Protestant Socinian Society, also called the Polish Brethren, during the Polish-Swedish War, which lasted from 1655 until 1660. The relative political weakness of Poland-Lithuania's royal government and the limited power of the king is comparable perhaps only to the situation in the Holy Roman Empire. This situation gave individual groups greater bargaining power here than elsewhere in Europe. The overall pattern of organization and cohabitation was by no means unique. Also, the choice and development of the Union's capital showed the need for compromises. Poland's capital of Krakow, Kraków in Polish, was located too far south, and Lithuania's capital of Vilnius, Vilno in Polish, too far north. Gradually, therefore, a city of hitherto modest significance, called Warsaw, Warszawa in Polish, lying in halfway between Kraków and Vilnius, became the Union's new capital in the 16th century, which made it easier for both parts of the Union to convene. In Poland-Lithuania, all three of the most scattered groups of Europe were present: the Germans, the Jews, and the Roma. As I have already indicated, during the so-called Saxonian period of Polish-Lithuanian history, from the end of the 17th until the middle of the 18th century, the king of Poland-Lithuania was of German origin. Also, Germans took over important roles in some parts of the state, for example in the navy and civilian shipping. The greatest measure of autonomy was accorded to the Jewish community, which had the right to administer its members across Poland-Lithuania independently of the specific places of residence. The Roma, however, were the only group never granted such a status, as the Poles regarded them as economically, socially, and politically unimportant.
Many groups, called by labels which we today associate with particular countries, lived in many different parts of the European continent. As Dr. Conrad has mentioned, Germans, for instance, inhabited not only the Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland and Austria, but also the Baltic, as well as various regions in East and Southeast Europe, like Transylvania, today in Romania, where German speakers often enjoyed relatively high social status as merchants, craftsmen, or specialists in industries like mining. Over the course of the early modern period, German-speaking communities grew or newly developed elsewhere in Europe and its colonies as a result of migration. In the second half of the 18th century, for instance, Empress Catherine II attracted German agricultural settlers to Russia. Like Augustus the Strong of Poland-Lithuania, Catherine had been born in Germany. She married the later Russian Tsar Peter III in 1744, before becoming Empress of Russia in 1762. Less directly, marriages between members of European royal houses and German princely families paved the way for the accession of Prince-elected George Louis of Hanover as King George I of Great Britain and Ireland in 1714. Such marriage connections were typical of the European aristocracy in general. This is not to say that interethnic relations in early modern Europe were characterized by general tolerance. Far from it. Jews and Roma were regularly marginalized as strangers, troublemakers, and even enemies. Yet drawing boundaries was not always straightforward. Jews, for example, were understood as both an ethnic and a religious community, and their position was fraught with a great deal of ambivalence. While Christian majority societies sometimes regarded them as witnesses of faith worthy of protection, they were also aggressively stigmatized as blasphemers and diabolical evildoers, or held responsible for the death of Christ. Hence, contemporary pictorial representations of Jews, such as those seen in the slide, were usually defamatory. Moreover, Christians, and to some extent Jews themselves, were concerned with strict separation between the groups. Since the Middle Ages, ecclesiastical and secular authorities had attempted to visually distinguish Jews from Christians by distinctive clothing and markings such as the yellow badge, with varying success. Separate streets and city quarters, like the Venetian ghetto established in 1516, created largely separate spheres of life. Legislation regulated everyday interactions between Christians and Jews, and the latter were excluded from the guilds as well as numerous economic activities. However, such regulations, along with safe conduct and limited rights of communal self-administration, also protected Jewish life. Segregationist measures came to an unprecedented climax with the expulsion of the Sephardic Jews from Spain in 1492 and Portugal in 1496 to 1497. In addition, so-called conversos, or new Christians, Iberian Jews who had converted to Christianity, were suspected of crypto-Judaism and barred from certain offices, as well as travel to the Spanish Americas by the policy of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Expulsion as such was not new, though. European Jews had regularly been exiled across the continent since the Middle Ages, and European rulers also implemented resettlement policies when they hoped for economic and fiscal benefits from the particular skills, commerce, and financial networks of Jewish people. In a variety of roles, Jews, therefore, were an essential part of Christian societies. Nevertheless, their emancipation did not occur until the end of the early modern period, and in some regions, even later. Like the Jews, the Roma who had come to Western Europe at the beginning of the 15th century faced considerable mistrust. By the 16th century, Roma communities were increasingly marginalized and discriminated against. Contradictory ethnic labeling, for instance as Egyptians and Tatars, the Romani word Roma does not appear in the sources, and the frequent abuse as heathens also show how difficult contemporaries found it to place the new minority into any clear category. Some commentators even claimed that Romani identity had simply been assumed by vagabonds, thieves, and robbers. And numerous European territories tried to expel the Roma under the regulations of poor laws aimed especially at itinerant groups. Such hostility was also expressed in texts and images. Despite these hardships, Roma were part of most early modern European societies as often highly specialized craftsmen, traders, workers, soldiers, and entertainers, and their history cannot be reduced to persecution. The status and fate of the Roma as a group, or more precisely a wide range of communities, varied over time as well as space. While Roma living in Hungary were at times more firmly integrated into the feudal structures and thus less marginalized, those in the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia were enslaved for several centuries. The 18th century saw new waves of persecution and aggressive disciplinary measures across the continent, so that even at the end of the early modern period, the Roma retained a precarious position.
Europeans of the early modern age were aware of their ethnic diversity, even if what we today refer to as ethnic categories were more fluid at that time. Ethnicity did not have the same political significance ascribed to it by the later nationalism of the 19th and 20th centuries, and different ethnic groups coexisted in all European polities. Such coexistence was not necessarily always peaceful, and there were significant power asymmetries between different groups. Especially marginalized minorities were generally disadvantaged and mistreated. On the other hand, their identities as distinct groups did at times afford them a degree of protection and autonomy, especially when early modern authorities considered them expedient. This model of relative communal autonomy with direct relations to the ruler was characteristic of most multi-ethnic polities. To some extent, this principle also extended to peoples at Europe's edges, such as the Sami in northern Scandinavia, one of the few remaining non-Christianized groups until the 18th century. However, the right of self-administration also existed in tension with rulers' attempts to increase their control over their subjects, mobilize their resources, and homogenize their beliefs. Therefore, interethnic relations in early modern Europe were precarious, unstable, and subject to change over time. Finally, Europe's increasing entanglements with lands and peoples beyond its shores had already given rise to a growing presence of people from distant countries as a result of conquest, enslavement, and religious missions. In the 16th century, for instance, Sevilla in Spain was home to a sizable community of people of African descent. Thus, Europe's ethnic diversity in general further increased in the early modern period.